At the threshold of the red house, the housekeeper looked over her shoulder quickly, back towards the hall and the strained sounds of the stairlift. And without looking at Catherine, Maud clutched one of her hands and pressed her mannish fingers into Catherine's palm to leave a piece of paper behind. "Oh no, you don't have to," Catherine said to a closing and then shut door, thinking the housekeeper had tipped her like a tradesman. It wouldn't have surprised her if these two isolated and out-of-touch figures still observed such a custom, but when she bent over to chase the paper that had fluttered from her hand and come to rest on the tiles of the porch, she could see that it wasn't money. It was a crumpled piece of brown paper. Beyond the thick door came the muted yet frantic peal of the handbell. Catherine picked the paper and straightened it out. It was spattered with what looked like grease. She turned it over. Written in pencil in stubby capitals were 4 words: "Don't never come back." The past. For some, it's the cherished memories of a time gone by, when, full of innocence, your biggest concern was simply how to occupy the copious amounts of free time between school and bed. Others identify it as the catalyst to lifelong passions in the period of their lives where they discovered the one thing they were put on this planet to achieve, and consequently spend the rest of their lives reaching for it. The less fortunate see it as a looming shadow and harbinger of despair and anguish. It's a creature they continue to evade lest it gets a grip on them and traps them in its domain for constant suffering and endless torment. It's fond memories of loved ones who care for us, and the devastation we feel when they are taken away. For others, like Catherine, it's an uncertainty. A film that continues to play in her own mind, but it's out of focus. Unable to depend on her own account of events gone by, what truly happened, she has wandered her life aimless, stumbling into one terrible situation after another. She may have found a sort of solace in perpetually convincing herself that the unexplained events of her childhood were simply a byproduct of an overactive imagination and childhood spent with a loose grip on reality. But when she agreed to be the valuer of an infamous collection of the late M.H. Mason, it became quite clear that everything she thought she knew about the world and herself would be questioned. The House of Small Shadows is the 5th novel by British horror bestseller Adam Nevill. Neville's been nominated for the UK-based August Derleth Award 6 times since 2011 and has won 3. Small Shadows, unfortunately, was one of the nominations that didn't actually win the award, which I'm actually happy about because I tend to like being introduced to authors by reading some of their less acclaimed work. That way, if I end up liking it, I'm more likely to come across even better tales by reading their other offerings. This is why I intend to read Tremblay's Disappearance at Devil's Rock before reading A Head Full of Ghosts, since Devil's Rock is almost universally agreed to be the lesser work, at least with who I talk to. Full disclosure, I have no idea how prestigious the August Derleth Award actually is, but it does seem to have an impressive pedigree, and I'm familiar with Derleth from his work with Lovecraftian horror and his role in actually getting Lovecraft's work published in the first place. He's the founder of the Arkham House publishing company that is still in operation to this day, despite being nearly 80 years old, so I stand impressed nonetheless. On a surface level, this book promises an unsettling, isolating romp in what we can assume to be a large, turn-of-the-century mansion. The cover and the blurb make reference to puppets and dolls, so of course I went into the novel expecting a haunted house story, only instead of incorporeal poltergeists, we will be treated to porcelain dolls and wooden marionettes. And although we are treated to flashes of that kind of narrative, the story of the Red House is far more complex and, unfortunately, somewhat convoluted. Small Shadows is a psychological dive documenting our protagonist, Catherine's, descent into madness. We learn about her mysterious past and laments, but not only experiencing them with her in a number of flashback chapters, but also in dreams as she sleeps, and in exposition delivered both directly and indirectly by other characters. The surreality of how the story plays out is reinforced by Catherine's constant internal conflict, where she explains away some of the more absurd events by self-identifying as, potentially, an unreliable narrator. As tension rises, she more frequently calls into question her interactions and memories of her experiences at the Red House. It feels as though Neville's intent was to keep the reader on edge and guessing as to whether or not any of this was actually happening, or is Catherine just an ill woman succumbing to unimaginable stress and circumstance. Nevill is quite adept at painting a vivid picture of everything Catherine witnesses, even the surreal stuff that she has trouble processing. His descriptions are great, although if you're not familiar with turn-of-the-century era clothing and classical architecture, you may have to Google some of the terminology he uses, but hey, it makes his work descriptive and educational. The story is a slow burn, so if you're into faster-paced horror, then this probably isn't a good selection for you. But I feel like the pacing was ideal for this type of story. There's plenty of individual scenes that will drag you out of your comfort zone and send a chill down your spine, but the real strength of the work is Catherine's gradual degradation throughout the whole story. In the beginning, this was simply a job for her, a once-in-a-lifetime kind of job with a huge payday attached to it. But very early we catch glimpses into her past and personal events, both past and present, and they begin to shake her up psychologically. This makes her entire stay at the Red House, once her host insists she begin to stay the night instead of traveling back and forth each day, become a question of whether Catherine is just going mad from all this suppressed stress and heartache. Is the odd noises and occurrences in the house simply a projection of her own psychosis? And I think this psychological uncertainty is really the strength of this novel. The history and lore uncovered about the past of M.H. Mason and the life of his niece was intriguing as well, and with the exception of the last third of the book, I think it was adequately sprinkled throughout the narrative, so you never find yourself with too much of an info dump or staring down an endless wall of text. There was also no wasted elements of the story. Early in the process, we were learning a lot about Catherine's childhood and current living situation, and for a long time I was weary that it was simply random stuff thrown at us to explain why she was so easy to lose her mind later. But Nevill successfully fired each of Chekhov's guns that he placed on the mantle in that first act. Not all of it was overly compelling, but it was all utilized, and that's still worth some praise. All in all, I would say that Nevill is quite a competent purveyor of the horror genre, and although this may not have been the most dazzling of introductions to a new author, it was done well enough that I will still pick up one of his other books. Eventually. My overall experience prompts me to say that generally I enjoyed this book, but unfortunately I just can't bring myself to do that. Although I think Nevill is a competent author and even has quite defined horror chops, there's something missing from House of Small Shadows that prevented me from being too positive in this review. You see, in horror, especially when you have a single character or duo isolated from everything they know and placed in an unfamiliar and dangerous setting, the single most important thing to get right is to establish a solid connection between the reader and the protagonist. You need to have a character that will engage with the reader and have them invested in their fate. Whether it's an, oh my god, I hope they find a way out of this, or it's, god damn he's an asshole, can't wait to see him die. Either way, a connection must be there. As much as I praise the slow burn and the psychological breakdown of Catherine, there was not a single point in this story when I really cared whether or not she was going to make it out of the situation. There was no time where I found myself rooting for her or hating on her. She was just there. I was curious about what was happening, how the history of the house and the surrounding village played a role in the events, and I was curious about what everything meant and what was going on. This wouldn't be bad for some other genre, but in horror it's universally better to have the reader continue out of investment in your character story instead of curiosity for the backstory without really caring about the peril of the protagonist. And this could be just a cultural thing. Maybe there's some cadence that I missed that wouldn't have been as jarring to a reader from the UK, but the weakest aspect of the novel, in my opinion, was the dialogue. I think this ties into my disconnect with the character. Most of the dialogue felt quite artificial, not so much that it wasn't realistic per se, but let's just say it read a lot more like a character in a book speaking and not actual adults conversing with each other. Though, as a positive to Nevill, I think he may agree with me that his dialogue isn't the strongest because throughout the story, it wasn't used all that often. The bulk of the prose consists of description and action, and the dialogue is mainly only used when necessary, and even then, other than the final third of the book, it's used quite sparingly. So I labeled 2018 as the year I finally reconnect with horror. I've been a terrible bedfellow for the genre in recent years, and I need to make it up now. I consider myself knowledgeable and a lifetime student of horror, and yet I only read my first Grady Hendrix novel this year. I've yet to touch the work of Paul Tremblay, Anya Alborn, and Josh Mallerman, and it feels good to finally dive into Adam Nevill. It's unfortunate that it wasn't the best of experience, but he displayed enough promise to keep me interested in more of his work. While he's operating in his comfort zone, with detailed descriptions of horrific scenes and nightmare-fuel situations, I think Nevill does a fantastic job. There's something under the surface of his writing that I can't help but respect and in part admire, and at the same time not quite articulate the words to describe what I'm referring to. If only I could have found a way to connect with that main character, this could have been a terrific book. But unfortunately, that's a big concern. And in this kind of story, specifically, it's kind of a deal breaker. You could have the most insanely powerful parts under the hood, but with no engine, that car isn't going very far. So all in all, it was a very meh experience. Not enough to give a glowing review, but not horrible enough to warn you to stay away. It wasn't a home run, but wasn't really a strike one either, maybe more of a foul ball. I'll give Nevill another shot. In fact, actually, how about some insight from you fine folks out there? Which of these two Adam Nevill books do you think I should try next? Make your voices heard. I'm pretty sure I know which one I'm leaning towards myself, but I'm going to keep an open mind, and, if there's any fans of Nevill out there that may want to persuade me one way or another, it's always welcome to have the conversation in the description below. But for now, that does it for me. I am out of here. I'll see you guys later. Cheers.